Judge Cohn, it's a privilege to be with you here today. I'm Fred Baker, and I'm here on behalf of the Michigan Supreme Court Historical Society. And we've made a special effort to include you among the oral histories that we have are acquiring for our library because of the enormous impact you've had over the course of your very long career on Michigan jurisprudence and the Michigan judiciary. Your career has been so long that you have lived to see yourself be part of history. And I mean that in the kindest way possible and in the most admiring way possible. You've been a fixture of my entire career, there from the beginning to this moment. And it's a pleasure and a privilege to interview you today. The Supreme Court Historical Society is aware that you've done a number of oral history interviews. And what we have discussed is how we can focus on parts of your career that haven't really been touched upon in those other interviews. And we're going to focus today on two large categories, if you will. One of them is your impact on the Michigan judiciary as a practitioner before assuming the bench. And the other is the relationships you've had with many Michigan justices. You span justices who served under the 1908 Constitution. Your acquaintances include justices who served on the 8-member court and right through the present day. And there are a number of these justices about whom you have some stories to tell, and we'd like to hear them. So I'd like to begin, unless you have any opening statement you'd like to make, I'd like to begin by turning right away to an important document that you were responsible for preparing, and it's the report of the Special State Bar Committee on Court Congestion, which I have before me because it's pretty lengthy. And that report, which was prepared in submitted to the court in 1978, was prepared and submitted at a time when Thomas Giles, I believe I have the right Kavanaugh, there are so many of them, was Thomas Giles Kavanaugh was Chief Justice. Am I correct?
Yes. The report was a product of an initiative by Joe Hardig, who was president of the State Bar and a good friend of mine. He came to me and he said he thought the question of court congestion required attention, and would I take the chair of a special committee to study court congestion? And I said yes. And the report was the product of 8 or 9 months effort, and I had a personal interest in seeing the report was well done.
How so?
I was concerned that I was thought as a political lawyer and a kind of lightweight in the system. So I determined to do the best job I could to establish my credentials or bona fides as a serious lawyer. And so I invested a lot of energy in it. Unfortunately, I recall, after the committee was appointed, it appropriated only $500 for expenses. And when the report was released, it was a thunderbolt. And I'll leave it at that and wait for your questions.
Well, There are many aspects of this report that must have excited controversy. I was unaware of this report because I started practicing in 1975. I returned from Missouri, where I went to law school at Washington University, and I wasn't aware of this report when I was clerking for, I guess, Judge Danhoff at that time, and reading it in retrospect with the hindsight of 45 years, I can see that this report transformed, it sort of terraformed the entire court system, I think, because I'll start with the Supreme Court Administrative Office. If it existed, in fact, it had very little impact on how the courts were run, and now it is an institution unto itself and dictates a great deal of what the lower courts do. And I'd like you to talk about the aspect of the report that emphasized the importance of developing the supervisory authority of the Supreme Court Administrative Office.
Well, there's a sentence in the introduction to the report that really caught the attention of the media and everybody. And that was, we said, the court, by the Constitution, is to manage the Michigan judicial system, and it appears it had neither the desire nor the will to fulfill that obligation. That's what the media seized on.
And that was warmly received, I'm sure, by the court.
Well, it seriously offended Thomas Giles Kavanaugh, the Chief Justice. I don't know whether the rest of the justices paid much attention to it. He was so offended by that sentence that I recall that at a state bar luncheon, as part of the period in which it was released, he walked out. I had been instrumental in getting the nomination for Tom for the court at a Democratic state convention, so I was very close to him. And my story of helping him become a candidate is a separate item, but he was so offended by that he stopped talking to me. And his wife never talked to me again. I'm convinced he was aware, if he paid any attention to it, which he probably didn't, of a draft of the report, because one of the members of the special committee had worked for him and was very close to him. The mistake we made was we did not share a draft of the report in advance with the court to enable it to respond, so that when it was released, the court's response was part of the overall report. That's the most I can say about it. I was aware that your whole contact with the court, if you were a lawyer outside of the court, was with the clerk. There was really not much of an administrative office, and local judges sort of operated on their own without much direction from the court, in contrast to today, where the court, and particularly with the Chief Justice, Bridget McCormick, plays a very important role in the management of the system and takes its responsibilities very seriously.
I can see, looking at this report, and in retrospect, that it was the beginning of it was a snowball that rolled down the hill and led to the centralization and standardization and the implementation of uniformity throughout all of the circuit courts and the lower courts. as a result of the recommendations in this report. One of the aspects of the report that startled me was the observation of the lack of uniformity, not only in salaries and how judges were paid from circuit to circuit and court to court, but also how they conducted a court and the rules that they adopted. Can you comment, if you recall, about that aspect of the report?
I remember the report commenting on it. You got to remember, nobody on the committee, as I recall it, was a member of the Judiciary. So that the changes that occurred subsequently to the release of the report were all within the judicial system. And if you weren't a judge and were part of that system, you didn't have much awareness of what is taking place.
One of the changes that occurred within, I think, about 6 years, the Michigan court rules were completely revised. And this really stemmed from some recommendations you made in this report, or your committee made, about the court rules, the General Court Rules of 1963 and their deficiencies. Did you notice these changes happening? Could you see the connection between what you had recommended in this report and what followed?
No, I did not spend sufficient time in the litigation section of the law firm I was with to appreciate those changes. I will tell you that his senior partner, Jason Honigman, wrote most of the rules for the court from the beginning, because when I began practicing, the treatise on the rules was labeled Honigman's Court Rules. He had the ability, Jason, when he was given a problem by the court, to write a rule from beginning to end in one session with his secretary. He could find the paragraphs, the sections, the subsections orderly. He didn't have to really edit his own work. I think also that the persona of the Chief Justice played an important part. I don't recall the sequence of Chief Justices, but I think over the years after 1978, more and more the Chief Justice exercised authority over the circuit courts. Just remember, the Court of Appeals came in about the middle of that, but it was managed by T. John Lazinski, the late T. John. And if you knew T. John, he ran a very tight ship. It was under T. John Lazinski's role that every Court of Appeals and Supreme Court Justice, every Court of Appeals judge and every Supreme Court Justice got a car, an automobile, paid for by the state. And the plate that had a 1 on it, that was the Chief Justice's car.
Yeah. I remember those cars. I used to clerk for Judge Danhoff. It was a black Chrysler, and it said MSG, and then in priority, the Court of Appeals judges had numbers in the higher numbers than the Supreme Court. But yes, they all had cars. And it was one of the perks of the office. But remember, they weren't as well paid back then.
No, that's true. You got to remember, Fred, that the report was released in September 1978. And by that time, it was well known that I was either vying for a seat on the district court or was on the list of lawyers who Don Riegel was going to recommend become federal judges, so that within months, in less than a year after the report was released, I was no longer practicing law and was an observer of the court from a distance. And the role I assumed then was to write letters to the editor critical of certain actions of the court, so that I would not have been privy or close to the changes in the rules or how they operated.
Well, I can tell you, it was a revelation, sort of a thunderbolt to me, as well as to Thomas Giles Kavanaugh, when I read this, to see how much impact it obviously had in light of the changes that were subsequently made. Not only were the court rules completely revised, and I think some of the impetus for that is this report, and the process of the adoption of local rules was made uniform and required to go through the Supreme Court Administrator's Office, but the whole process of discovery under the old general court rules, which was, those court rules you could read in maybe 2 hours. I did read them from beginning to end, the old GCRs. It takes hours of study now to go through our court rules. They are so intricate, but they also provide very clear guidance to any lawyer in almost any situation. And I think that whole process of refining and reforming the court rules flows from this report. It had an enormous impact, and discovery especially. So if you have any other reflections or comments on this report, I'd love to hear them, but I think we have touched on the enormous impact they had. So I'll leave you just a pause there if you had any other thoughts about them, and then I have one follow-up question.
No, I think I've said all I can. The report speaks for itself. I've encouraged, I put in play to convince Carl Herstein, who's president of the Supreme Court Historical Society, that it would be worthwhile to take the report on the left hand of the page and follow through each of its recommendations to see to what extent today the expectations embodied in the recommendations have been fulfilled. But you're telling me that it was a stimulus, and here, 40 years later, I guess I'm prouder now than I was then of the report.
You should be. This was an enormous force for change and for the good in the courts. Whether you fully realize it or not, I was astonished as I read through it. I think, so that's why we did that. So that's why things are the way they are.
I have one more thought. From the time I began practicing law, I had a hobby of judge watching. So I liked my relationships with judges. I was involved in numerous campaigns. But I do recall my late father, who was a good lawyer, very good lawyer, always said, when I went to law school, there was a big sign on the law at the entrance that said, "Know the law." I was up there last week, and the sign had changed to say, "Know the judge."
Oh, no.
So he had a jaundiced eye about judges, and I guess father like son.
Um,
Son like father.
we have to realize that they are human beings, I guess. But my follow-up question, because when you told me that the release of this report had that impact on your personal relationship with Chief Justice Thomas Giles Kavanaugh, and with his wife, I could see why there might have been a reaction. But I wonder, did you ever repair that relationship?
Yeah, we eventually talked to each other friendly. After all, he was very close to Justice Charles Levin, and probably Levin's best friend in the court, and Levin his best friend. And I grew up with Charles Levin.
Yes.
So that inevitably we came together when Levin was around. And he talked to me. I think he got over his anger. What he did was he was angry with the report, so he personalized it by being angry with the chair.
Well, it's understandable, but I'm glad you were able to repair that, because he also played a part in implementing this report, whether he did so grudgingly or not. Change followed while he was still Chief Justice. But I'd like to take you back, if you don't mind, and proceed in a roughly chronological way to the justices whom you knew, who were justices under the 1908 Constitution, the 8-member court, in which the saying was that because there were 8 justices and 5 votes were required, the circuit judge was really the 9th justice, and effectively had a vote. You had to get a majority out of 8, and that was how decisions were made on that court. And you knew Paul Adams, you knew Otis Smith, you knew Justice Souris, you knew George Edwards, you knew justices who served on that 8-member court, which was a unique body. There was no court of appeals. It was the first resort and the last resort, and its jurisdiction was discretionary. So these justices wielded enormous power. Otis Smith fascinates me because I don't think most people realize this was a man who somehow, as an African American, became general counsel of General Motors, which was one of the most conservative corporate outfits on earth. Can you give us some insight into, from your knowledge and relationship with him, of how Otis Smith managed to become the prominent and ultimately a member of the prominent attorney and ultimately a member of the Michigan Supreme Court, and what part did you play in that?
Well, Otis had been elected Auditor General in 1960 or maybe 58. He was the first African American, as I recall, holding a statewide office. When John Swainson became governor...
Was his race an issue at that time?
No, but it was a novelty. It was a novelty. Listen, I can remember... anyhow, John Swainson appointed him a justice. About the same time, he convinced Paul Adams to resign as Attorney General because they didn't get along with him, and put Adams on the court. So it was around 62 that the two of them stood for election to fill vacancies. And in those days, you recall, justices were nominated in convention, and ran as independents, but they had strong party support. In any event, the then head of the Corporation Securities Division was given the responsibility of managing their campaigns. But he couldn't do it publicly, so he came to me. He says, "Cohn, do you want to you be chairman of their campaigns, and you be the front man for them." So the two of them ran as a team, and I managed their campaign. That is, I had to raise money because they had to go to the electorate and do other things. I can remember, for example, flying Otis Smith once to a party rally out in the western part of the state. I got a friend to give us his airplane and the pilot, and we went out there for the day. I also remember going back a bit earlier when Otis was going to be nominated. He was already a justice, but then he had to be nominated at the state party convention. I was in a room with him, with George Edwards, talking about the nominating speech, etc. And Otis said, "Now I want you to be absolutely clear. I want no mention made of the fact that I'm black." And he left. And Edwards looked at me. He says, "What do I do with that, Avern?" I says, "That's the reason he's the nominee." So anyhow, the two of them ran as a team. Surprisingly, we thought Otis was the weaker of the two. He won his seat. Paul Adams lost his seat.
Really?
Yeah, to Michael O'Hare, I think it was. And then a couple of years later, Otis had to run again. This time he was linked to Thomas Matthew Cavanaugh, Tom the Mighty, and Tom Cavanaugh paid no attention to Otis, that they were on the ticket together. So Otis was sort of left to fend for himself. I was not involved in that campaign. After it was over, I was talking to Otis's brother and said, "What happened?" He says, "You weren't the campaign chair, that's what happened." Anyhow, so now Otis is out of a job. And about that time, there was a seat open on the federal district court, and it was clear that it was going to go to a black person, and it would and it was likely to be between Otis and Damon Keith that the recommendation had to be made. And in the black community, there was a caucus of leadership, and the leadership told Phil Hart that they thought that Damon should get it, and Otis did not get it. The next thing we know is Otis is general counsel of General Motors. Now, what we don't know, at least I don't know, whether or not he was a cosmetic general counsel and put a good front for the office, but the actual workings of the office were handled by others. But he sort of got the, I always thought he got general counsel of General Motors as a consolation prize.
Well, I knew Damon Keith just a little bit because he was a friend, very good friend of John Volker's, and Volker's book Hornstein's Boy is really about Damon Keith. He's one of the principal characters in that book, and the other one is Bill Ellman, whom you probably knew.
I knew him very well.
as president of the state bar. And those two were the prototypes or the models for the characters in that book. And I once met Bill Ellman and Judge Keith in his chambers, and they both signed my copy of that book. He was an amazing, amazing man. Did you have a relationship with Damon Keith as well? You must have.
Oh, yeah. Well, Damon and I were friends before he became a federal judge. And I practiced before him. And I remember once coming to a status conference, and he came in front of him, and we all sat around the table, and Damon looked at me, he says, well, what do I do? What am I supposed to do this afternoon, Mr. Cohn? I want to crawl under the table. No, I was extremely close.
He was.
Damon.
He was. I received a check from him just weeks before he passed away for the Volcker Foundation. He loved John Volcker, and there's a story that tells why. They campaigned together when Volcker was running to fulfill, or he was appointed, and then he had to run to serve out the term that he was appointed to fill. And he campaigned with Keith. And a friend had given him the use of his membership at the Detroit Athletic Club, which was then restricted. And he showed up there at the dining room with Damon Keith for lunch. And it was a difficult situation for the maitre d', who finally put them behind a potted palm next to the door to the kitchen. And they got up and stalked out together, and they were fast friends after that.
Well, talking of Volcker, he was appointed, and he had to run, of course.
Yes.
And I was involved in his campaign. Bill Ellman was his campaign manager.
Yes. Oh, he loved Bill Ellman.
And within 2 years after we all worked our fannies off for him, he left the court, which we thought was not a very great book. Yeah, but we thought it was not a very gracious thing to do. I had some relationship with Volcker you may find of interest, and I've written about this. In around 70, I don't remember the exact time, but reapportionment became a legal issue. And there was a case in the Supreme Court, Scholl v. Hare. Scholl was head of the state AFL-CIO. Hare was Secretary of State, in which Scholl was challenging the geographical distribution of Senate seats. Pardon?
It was Gus Scholl?
Yeah.
The union?
Yeah. And one of the Republican senators or something said if the court decides this case against Scholl, they should all be impeached. Zoltan Farrisee, who was chair of the Democratic Party, came to me. He said, you've got to get together a statement in opposition to that view. There are 4 justices, retired justices, around. Volcker, Bushnell, Butzel, and Edwards. And they should issue a statement condemning that kind of talk as irresponsible. So I started out to write the statement and saw that I could. And so I went to Paul Weber, who was Williams' former press man. He lived in my neighborhood, and he wrote the statement out for me. Now I had to get the signatures. With Bushnell, I called George Jr., asked him if his father would sign it. He came back, he said, sure. I called George Edwards. He said, sure. They had no idea what was in the statement. Then I had to get Henry Butzel. So I went to his son-in-law and told him what I was about. And I met Butzel in his office and showed him the statement, and he signed it. Now I had Volker to get his signature. He was in the Upper Peninsula.
How did you find him? He was elusive.
Yeah, well, he wasn't fishing that day. So I called him, told him what I was about, and told him about that. He says, send me the statement. Well, these days there was no FedEx. So I sent him the statement and told him to get back to me or get back to George Bushnell Jr. because I was going on the Mackinac race and I wasn't around to follow up. So I'm in a boat going across Saginaw Bay, listening to the news about 6 o'clock one morning. The first item in the news is 4 ex-justices condemn irresponsible talk. And the statement was released. So that's how I got to have a relationship with John Volker. And then Sue Marks, who's a filmmaker, did a documentary on Volker. And she was one of my closest friends, so I was very helpful to her in that. So that was how I knew.
I had a little bit part in another documentary she did called No Law Without Lawyers, and he was in that too.
Yeah.
It was a little connection we had. The bar did it.
You may also be interested in how I got to know Butzel and Bushnell.
I am.
For the first time. Well, I was practicing with my father.
They overlapped from the old Constitution to the new, didn't they both?
Yeah. But in any event, we're building a building. We represent a man who's building a warehouse alongside a sidetrack. And one of the owners of property on the sidetrack got very excited and sued to stop the construction of the building on the grounds that it was undermining the sidetrack. And we end up in circuit court, and the court made a ruling favorable to us and in opposition to the one who was objecting to the construction. And we come to the office the next day after the order's entered, and there's an emergency appeal to the Supreme Court with demand for immediate hearing to get the circuit court judge reversed. And so we've now got to prepare the papers, and we get a call from either Bushnell or Butzel. They shared offices together, that they had this petition, and it had been sent down to them by the clerk, and we should come over to their office and tell them what it's all about. So for the first time, I walk into an office with Bushnell and Butzel. And I was a very young lawyer. Oh, I was scared to death. And they say, they want to go and see what's going on. So we'll meet you at the site. I ran out of that office, got in my car first, got out there and saw what the construction crews were doing and gave them some kind of instructions that would cast a favorable light on what they were doing in the eyes of Bushnell and Butzel. And there they are walking up and down the sidetrack.
The justices took a view?
Yeah, the two justices.
That's amazing.
And, the case disappeared. So next justice I knew was George Edwards. He was originally a member of the Detroit City Council, and then he was elected a probate judge or appointed a probate judge in Detroit. And now he's on the Supreme Court. Then he gets appointed to the Supreme Court. And I'll never forget, my father tells me he's going to lunch with him. Well, I thought that was going to lunch with the Justice of the Supreme Court. And he comes back to the office. I said, how was the lunch? My dad said it was great. It cost me $1,000. What Edwards wanted was some money from him. And then, of course, Edwards left the court to become police commissioner. He couldn't stand Eugene Black.
A lot of people couldn't.
Yeah, I know. And so he left the court. Jerry Kavanaugh convinced him to leave the court and become police commissioner in Detroit, which he did.
You know, Gene Black and Volcker hit it off somehow. I used to get checks from him. He was completely blind.
Well, it would be easy to understand that because Volcker wasn't made out to be a justice.
No.
He was too much, he was a good lawyer. Being an appellate judge is a very, how can I put it, is a very passive.
It's monastic. He wrote 120.
Right, being a modern.
He wrote 121 opinions in 3 years.
Yeah. So that was my relationship with George Edwards. Then I developed the Paul Adams, John Volcker relationship. Otis Smith relationship by being their campaign managers. My next real interaction was with Thomas G. Kavanaugh. He was on the Court of Appeals with Chuck Levin.
Yes.
And Chuck comes to me and says, Tom wants to run for the Supreme Court. Can you help him? Well, the first thing he had to do is he had to get nominated by the convention. Well in advance of the convention, I went to the chair of the Democratic Party and said, you know, we go to the convention and we nominate justices. No one knows them. No one has paid any attention to them, etc. I said, don't you think it would be a good idea if we had a search committee in advance to give one candidate an endorsement? He says, yeah. He says, you want to be chair? I said, yes. That was the whole purpose. So now I got a half dozen fellows together and lawyers and said we should make a recommendation. And I think it should be Thomas Giles Kavanaugh. Well, the late Ted Sachs didn't know much about him. He says, well, I want to know something more about him. So I said, okay. So I go back and I tell Chuck to tell Tom to give me a half a dozen opinions. So he gives me the half of Kavanaugh, so I can give him to Ted Sachs. Ted Sachs, give them to him. Ted Sachs reads them. He says, okay, Avern, it's all right, I'll go with you. So we go to the state convention. And this was after, I remember going to the state convention in Grand Rapids. Coming from Chicago, I had been at the national convention. And to work and get Tom's nomination. Well, it goes through.
It's 1968?
Yeah, it goes through. And I see Tom, he says, well, now I can go home. I said, you can't go home. He says, what do you mean I can't go home? I says, I got to take a picture of everybody that's going to be on the ticket, and that won't be till tomorrow morning. You've got to stay for the picture. So, okay, he stayed for the picture. And that's how he got the nomination. So I was largely responsible for managing the process, which got him the nomination. I think it was I think it was at that convention, or there was one of the conventions that I was chair of a committee at the convention, and about 1 o'clock in the morning, we're sitting in the library, in the lobby, trying to write a resolution for the convention to adopt to commend the Supreme Court for, I think, the apportionment decision or something. And Otis Smith walked by. He says, "What are you doing?" I says, "We're working on this resolution to compliment the court." So he says, "You don't compliment somebody for doing what they're supposed to do." I'll never forget that. So that was my interaction with, another interaction with Tom. I was also very close to Ted Soros. If you look at the history, he was a lawyer in Detroit. We were classmates at Ann Arbor. And at a very young age, G. Minner Williams appointed him to the Wayne County Circuit Court. And shortly after, he appoints him to the Supreme Court. I think Ted was still in his 30s. And I found Ted office space in the Guardian building for the campaign, and supplied the paper and pencils for the office from our supply, and worked very hard to get Ted the nomination. He's now a justice of the Supreme Court, and the Constitution of 1963 had been adopted, which reduced the size of the court from 8 to 7. But however, any incumbent justice could run for re-election. Seat was protected. So Ted is now running for that 8th seat. And Ed Piggins is nominated by the Republican Party. Piggins was at first been police commissioner in Detroit and then was a Wayne Circuit judge. And our polling showed that Ted was sure to lose.
Now, that's so unusual. He was an incumbent, wasn't he?
Yeah, but he was going to lose. But Piggins was a very strong Knights of Columbus man and establishment man. And so Ted's, we're at a campaign meeting for Ted. And he says he's got his doubts. So I said to him, "Come on now, you either got to tell us you're going to run or you're not going to run. Because if you're not going to run, I got to find another candidate to support." Next day I get a call from Jane, his wife. He says, "Please lay off Ted. Doesn't know what to do. And you're putting pressure on him. Isn't helpful." So that day I go to Doubleday, which was in the Penobscot building, and buy a book. And I put in the front of it to my friend Ted Soros, "Wherever you go, I will follow. Avern." And he announces that he's not going to run for re-election, which eliminates the seat.
That's right. Only if an incumbent ran would the seat exist.
Yeah, well, the seat's now gone because he's not running. And they asked Piggins, and I'll never forget Piggins being quoted as saying, "I think it's unconstitutional that he did this." Because he cheated Piggins out of a seat. I was also very close to Blair Moody, who was first a Wayne County Circuit Judge and then appointed to the Supreme Court. He and I were close personal friends. And as you know, mentioned earlier, he had a heart attack and died. And after that,
He was very conscientious. His wife actually filed a workers' compensation claim on his behalf and recovered. Did you know that?
no, then I didn't.
She claimed that his work on the court was so arduous that it caused his heart attack, and she won.
No, I didn't know that. Well, after that, in '79, I no longer had a close. I was always involved with these justices because I was naive enough to think that if you were a contributor to their campaign or worked for them, it gave you an edge when you appeared in front of them. That was a very cynical view. But it was, that's why I was involved with judges all the time, because I was always a fundraiser or a fund contributor. When I became a district judge, I, of course, ceased to have any political relationships with any of them. But I followed the work of the court. From the time I was, from the time I was in law school, all the way through to now, I always read the advance sheets. So I knew what the work was doing. And I always sort of paid attention to what's called back of the volume, orders and so forth, where they're sniping at each other. And so, I can't remember the specific occasion, but I decided I would write a letter to the editor about something they did. And if you signed it Avern Cohn, district judge, it was more likely to get published. And I followed the work of the court. And in my early years on the bench, the Federalist Society Church chapter was much more active than it is today. And I remember being invited to symposiums on the role of the judge. Does he make law or does he decide that whole bit? And I ended up with a series of different appearances with Cliff Taylor, where he took the Federalist Society position, and I took the other contrary position. And so I got some notoriety in the bar about being, I would be trotted out as the liberal when the Federalist Society had a meeting so they could show that they were nonpartisan. And so Taylor and I had a couple of exchanges. Indeed, one of my law clerks prepared a box, a frame. And on one side there was Cliff Taylor, and on the other picture was me. And below Taylor, the clock stopped at 1789 or something. And below me, the clock was working.
But the clock stopping at 1789, I think, sort of tells a story. You also knew, and you haven't really, you've mentioned it passingly, but talk about your relationship with Chuck Levin. I think a lot of people have the impression that you're related.
No, we're not.
But you were sort of brothers from different mothers.
No, well, his father was a close personal friend of my father.
Yes.
And it was through my father that Carl and Sanders' mother was involved. She was a first cousin of my father, and she married Ted's younger brother. So,
Mishpucha.
yeah, that's right. So people sort of looked at, there was once an article in the United Airlines passenger magazine about politics in Michigan and grouped the two Levins, the Carl and Sander and Chuck and me as a political family. But I went to camp with Chuck in 1930s.
It was?
I went to camp, summer camp.
Do you remember which camp?
Yes, it was called Camp Moden. It was in Maine. It was a Orthodox sponsored summer camp. In any event, Chuck and I were up there together, and there's a picture that floats around. Shows two of us sitting on a bench with our camp sweaters, my arm around him, and it's labeled "The Boys on the Bench." So when Chuck first ran for the Court of Appeals after a vacancy, to fill a vacancy, the Detroit Bar Association for the first time endorsed candidates. And I got myself on the appellate committee and was responsible for his being rated by the Detroit Bar Association outstanding as a candidate. And his opponent, Jim Brickley, qualified. So Chuck ran around the first district with these big signs, rated outstanding, and I was the one that was responsible for getting him the outstanding. So I had a very close personal friendship with the judge. And when he got ready to run for the Supreme Court, I had a problem because I was a loyal Democrat, and the Democrats didn't choose him. They chose Horace Gilmore. So I could not publicly endorse him or show favoritism for Chuck because I would be a rebel to the party.
Did you have any hand in devising the unique strategy that he devised?
No, but my kids worked hard for him. Chuck Levin got to the Supreme Court.
He formed his own party.
He formed his own party. But the moving force there was his wife. It was once said that she was seen in Owasso one morning passing out campaign literature for Chuck, and that afternoon in a Tiger ball game passing out campaign literature for Chuck.
He tells the same story. She helped him hire someone. He had very little time.
Yeah.
And they hired somebody to gather signatures. In a week, I think in a week's time, they gathered 30,000 signatures or something like that.
That part of it I don't remember. But I do remember also, he had an office in the Prudential Tower in Southfield in Michigan, Chambers. And he had a huge library. And I had a key to his chambers. So whenever I needed, on a weekend, a law book or something, I could go to his chambers and get it. So we stayed very close while he was on the court all the way through. And in anticipation of this interview, I remembered writing an op-ed piece when he left the court. I thought it was in the Free Press, and that was entitled An Encomium to a Fine Judge, and I was unable to locate it. And yesterday, about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I got an inspiration. I called our librarian and said, maybe it was in the news, but I didn't think the news was archived. And at 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon, I had the article, which I wrote praising him. And that article, I was already a federal judge, of course, and it had a line in the article. He was a distinguished member of a not particularly distinguished court. So that got me a lot of notoriety. I once got chewed out by Bob Young. I don't know, we were having some exchange. And he said something about, you called my court, insulted my court for that phrase. He wasn't on the court at the time the article the op-ed piece was published. So I was always very close to him. And I also remember another incident you haven't asked me about yet, but one of my interactions with the court. This came before I was a district judge. I was attending, I was on a panel on the Open Meeting Act in Ann Arbor, which I didn't know anything about, but I was a panelist. And I saw, instead of the statute, it said administrative meetings of judges are subject to the Open Meeting Act. So I wrote a letter to the clerk. I said, whoever it was, under such and such, administrative meetings of the court are open to the public. Would you kindly advise me of the next administrative meeting? Yours truly. Chuck told me that when the court got the letter, or Kavanaugh got the letter, or something, well, he said, what do we do with this? So I don't hear anything. And then one day I opened my mail, and there's a copy of a court order nullifying sui sponte, that phrase in the statute. So that got me a bit of personal notoriety, but when I knew I was responsible for that that phrase. Much earlier, when I was practicing, I had a case which I won in the Court of Appeals and knew it was going to be appealed to the Supreme Court. And I also had become aware that the Supreme Court, for the first time, was acting sui sponte on applications for leave to appeal. By that time, the rules had developed. You had to file an application for leave. And it was acting sui sponte on some of those petitions. So if you were not the petitioner, the petitionee, you could find you'd lost your case before you ever got your papers filed. So I collected some statistics and showed the number of times such orders were entered sui sponte over a period of years, and there was a steady increase. So I wrote a letter to the editor of the State Bar Journal, cautioning lawyers that when an application for leave to appeal is filed, be sure you get in your response quickly, because you could find yourself out of court before you ever got a chance. And I recall there was a letter from a couple of issues later from some lawyer saying he found that he had great difficulty explaining to his client how they lost before they filed. So that was another incident where I interacted with the court.
You had relationships with members of the Kavanaugh family, obviously, because Jerry was the mayor and M.F. Kavanaugh was on the court. Can I steer you to Mike Kavanaugh?
Sure.
And I'd like to hear how that relationship.
I knew him and would see him and we would talk, and it was a very friendly relationship. And I was always very proud of the fact that I knew him, because I thought he was an excellent justice. He was quiet. He did his work properly, dutifully, and always came to the right decisions as far as I was concerned. So it could be said we had a common jurisprudence. And more recently, is his daughter is the one that's on the Court of Appeals now?
No, she's on the Supreme Court now.
Now, okay, she's on the Supreme Court.
It's
Well,
becoming a dynasty.
When she got elected,
She did.
or maybe it was before, anyhow, Jules Oldsman, who knows all the judges in the whole state, and I brought her to lunch with me one day so I could talk to her about the court, which she was likely to meet up with. So that was my relationship with Mike. It was it was informal, but by the time he got to the court, I was already a federal judge. So obviously I could not have campaigned for him or contributed to his campaign.
He was, I knew him, he was sort of the hero of all the pre-hearing attorneys, and that's where I started out with the court before I clerked for Judge Danhoff. And when I clerked for Judge Danhoff, I would make it a point to go to his office as often as possible because he had a wonderful secretary who was a joy to behold. And I got to know him that way, just by sort of hanging around in his chambers. And I discovered something about him that I think is pretty remarkable. He kept an index of every issue he had ever decided. And he was meticulous in keeping that index, so that throughout his career, if he had addressed an issue before, he used that as a touchstone for whatever he decided, and he didn't depart from past decisions unless there was a reason to. He was, you say he was quiet, but he was also extremely, extremely meticulous.
Yeah, well, he was also probably had a latent concern that he didn't end up being confronted with inconsistent
That's right.
views of the same issue from an earlier time to a later time.
And with a career that long, it's probably a good thing he did it. I think altogether he served, if I recall correctly, 37 years on the bench. He set the record for combined years on the bench of any Michigan judge. But I think you're right up there in terms of service on the federal bench, aren't you?
I'm no longer serving district judge in the history of the district. 40 years.
40.
40.
Long time. Yeah.
Long time.
That's remarkable. You also knew Justice Archer, who has served in both executive capacities as the mayor of the city and also as a justice of the Supreme Court. Can you tell us a little bit about Justice Archer?
Yeah, well, I knew Archer. I can't remember how I met him. But I had a friendly relationship with him. Dennis's aspiration was to be president of the American Bar Association. and he achieved that. That to him, I believe, was more important than being mayor of Detroit or as justice of the Michigan Supreme Court. He got elected to the court, I can't remember when. Well, while he was on the court, he was friendly with the late Richard Van Dusen, who was a partner in Dickinson. And I think that Richard got him to leave the court to groom him for mayor, and was largely responsible for his running for mayor. And one of the great losses to the bar and the whole community, as far as I am concerned, was when Richard pretty much died very young. He was a very significant figure in the community and a force for good. And he was like Archer's mentor. So, but you'd have to ask Archer about that.
Well, I hope someday, and I'm making a note, if I do the interview, I hope someday maybe I'll get a chance to ask him about that. Justice Mallet was also someone you had a relationship with, I believe.
Yes. Yeah.
Conrad, Justice Conrad Mallet.
Oh, Conrad Mallet. Well, I knew Conrad. He'd been on the street, and then he was Chief Justice, and I ran into him. And he was the one that said to me, "You're like a 10th Justice," because of my letter writing.
Because of your letter writing.
Yeah. But we would see each other on occasion at social affairs or at not political affairs, bar affairs.
Justice Williams.
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. If you weren't finished with Justice Mallet.
No, that's all.
Okay. Justice Williams is one you haven't really touched upon, and I think you must have had
Who?
Justice Williams, Soapy.
Oh, Soapy. Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, Soapy, I knew him as governor, as a contributor.
6 terms, I believe he served.
That's right. And then he made the mistake of proposing, he aspired to be vice president. At the National Convention in 1960, he made the mistake of opposing Lyndon Johnson for vice president.
Yeah.
So when the campaign was over, he was no longer governor, and they rewarded him by making him Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs.
Yes.
In any event, he was then ambassador to the Philippines, and he came back to Detroit and decided to run for the Senate in 1966. And I was his campaign treasurer. And he had lost his luster. I remember that most of the campaign was funded by him personally, by my going and getting a check from him. And he lost, of course, rather badly. He was a very bad candidate for Senate. And after...
Was that Griffin?
Pardon?
Was that against Griffin?
Yeah, against Griffin. Well, he then, after he lost, he called a series of meetings of people who had supported him to talk about what he would do next. So I remember at a lunch at his house, either I or someone else suggested maybe he ought to run for the Supreme Court. And his response was, "I don't know anything about the court. I don't know anything about the law. I haven't practiced law. No, that's not for me. And the next thing I know is he announces he's running for the Supreme Court. And he got there, and of course he became Chief Justice. And he was a very bad Chief Justice because he didn't organize well. And he was also very naive about the law. I think his law clerks did more of the work than he did.
Oh, I'm sure.
You know, scholarly he was not. And then
I encountered him. I encountered him with my daughter, my first daughter, when she was very little. I took her to the fair, and I bought some tickets. And I turned around and I was counting my money, looking down at my hands, and this hand came into my field of view, and I looked up, sort of startled. And it was Soapy, and he said, "I don't want your money, I want your vote," and shook my hand. That's the kind of politician he was.
No, he was a good politician. He was friendly. He was very well motivated. But as a lawyer, he was not as good as he was as a justice. He wasn't as good as he was as a governor because he really didn't have a feel for the law.
He learned on the job, I believe.
Yeah.
But don't we all?
Yeah. Go ahead.
What surprised me when we did our little preparatory discussion about this interview was that you told me you had a relationship with Chief Justice Young, Robert Young. Now, I know he's a Detroit fellow, and he went to Harvard, and his father was a physician, and so he came from a prominent family. Did you know him before?
Yes, I knew him when he was a lawyer at Dickinson. I interacted with him as a lawyer at Dickinson. No, he was a lawyer at Dickinson. I was already a district judge. And he was very self-confident. If he took a position, that position was the correct one. Not because it was the correct one, but because he took it. And there was a touch of arrogance in him. As I told you, he confronted me once about something, about my distinguished court, etc. On the other hand, at my portrait presentation in our court, he came, which I was very flattered by. But he was very strong-willed, confident in whatever position he took was the correct one because he took it, and also conservative.
Very. He has probably the largest vocabulary of any justice I encountered. He made it a point to use precise words.
Erudite.
Yes, very erudite. Mary Beth Kelly, I think, is someone I was also surprised to learn that you knew.
I knew Marilyn from...
Marilyn, okay.
I knew Marilyn from the Democratic Party events because she was a good Democrat.
Oh, yes, she was.
And her husband was a good Democrat. So I knew her personally. I also knew Mary Beth Kelly because while she was chief judge of the Wayne County Circuit Court, we got to know each other.
Yes.
And she was trying, I think one of the ways we got to know each other is she was trying to organize a historical society for the court and asked me for my advice. So I had a number of interactions with her. I can't recall the specifics where we would talk and she would ask me for advice. So it was a personal relationship.
You've talked about your your debates with Cliff Taylor, but did you have any personal relationship with him? I know he's from Lansing, so you wouldn't have.
No, I did not have.
And finally, at least in my notes, I was again a little surprised to find that you had a relationship with Maura Corrigan. Now she was a Republican, but I don't know that she always was.
No, yes, she was. Come on, Maura was always on the conservative side. Her late husband was a professor at Wayne.
Yes.
A great guy, very conservative. I can't remember what his name escapes me, but I knew Maura. After all, Maura was also a chief assistant United States attorney in my early years as a judge. I can recall in my early years as a judge a case where I made a ruling, and she called me. She was U.S. attorney at the time. She was very pregnant. She called me, said she wanted to come and see me. And so she came over. She says, I have to tell you something. We made a serious error, and we're going to have to confess it in one of your cases. And I got so upset, I thought I started yelling so loud she was going to have the baby there in my chambers. But anyhow, so when she got to the court, of course I knew her.
It was Professor Grano.
What? Joe Grano, sure.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, Joe Grano and Yale Morris' husband, and Yale Camisar, professor at Michigan, philosophically differed on a couple of major points of criminal law, both very prominent.
Yeah.
And Joe should have been teaching at Harvard, not at Wayne, because he was the star of the Wayne faculty. So that's how I knew her, and I ran into some of these Federalist encounters, and after she left the court, I had a personal relationship with her.
I guess my impression of her as having a softer side comes from her deep concern for children and
Yes.
their welfare. And I think that's something that characterized her throughout her life, her career, and after she left the bench, when she headed the, I guess it was DSS before it became what it is now, DHH or DHHS. She put a strong emphasis on children. I had her write an article once for the Bar Journal, and I was surprised at how humane it was. Because she was a very conservative woman. But probably the best memory I've ever encountered.
Yeah, but she was a woman of substance.
Yeah. Well, you're not going to get a quarrel from me.
No. Go ahead.
I think we've come to the end of your list.
No, you got one more.
Oh, do we?
Yep. You haven't asked me about Patty Boyle.
Oh, you know what? She didn't come up in our preparatory discussion. Do talk about Patty Boyle.
Well, when Don Regal, a senior senator.
He was from Flint. I knew him.
Yeah.
I'm from Flint.
There were 2 vacancies in the district bench and 3 new seats that were going to be created. So he announced his recommendations for the 2 existing vacancies and the 3 new seats at the same time. And then said that Julian Cook and Patty Boyle was going to recommend. would get the two vacancies. Stu Blatt, Taylor, Anna Diggs Taylor, and myself would get the new seats. So Boyle and Cook, she came to the bench about a year before I did. She did not like being a federal judge for two reasons. It was a lot rougher place than the Recorder's Court, which she'd come from.
It was rougher than Recorder's Court?
Yeah, the district court, your interaction with lawyers. But anyhow, she didn't particularly like the subject matter of being a district judge. That's number one. Number two, her husband was an assistant Wayne County prosecutor and very political. And she couldn't go to the political events that he went to because she was a federal judge. And so their lifestyles had to be separate. This is my observation, true or not. So when the opportunity came up for Blanchard to appoint the justice, I don't know the details, but I know she resigned from our court to become a justice of the Supreme Court. An example, when she was a district judge, she had a very contentious case involving the filling of the position of front of the court in Wayne County. And she didn't like the lawyers. So she called me one day and says, "Will you take the case?" So I said, "Yeah," I reassigned it. And the lawyers complained bitterly about the reassignment. I says, "It's none of your business. It's an internal matter for the court. What else have we got to do?" So she now goes to the Supreme Court, and I would see her on occasion, and she was much happier on the Supreme Court because the nature of the work was much different. And at the same time, she got appointed to the Supreme Court. Her husband was appointed a Recorder's Court judge. And the rumor was that that was a deal that she made with Blanchard. "You want me to go to the Supreme Court? Okay, but you got to find a job for my husband." And then she served for many years. And while she was a good Democrat and a liberal, she was not very liberal in criminal cases.
He was tough on the criminal side. She was very tough on the criminal side. Yes.
Yes.
She remembered that.
So
I think you wrote a letter to Governor Blanchard. It's something I put in my notes, but I don't have much substance about it. You wrote a letter to the Detroit News about him. Do you recall mentioning that?
oh yeah, well, one of the letters I wrote involved his use of the power of pardon or commutation. If you remember, you may not, that in Blanchard's first 2 years, he had a tough time. There was a senator from Macomb that was recalled, and anyhow, he got stung in his first 2 years, so he was gun shy, and this is my view. And somehow the issue of commutation or pardon came up, and he had a very bad record on that. So I wrote a letter, it was prompted by something that I said, one of the most important roles that a governor fills is the power of pardon and commutation. And it's regretful that Jim Blanchard doesn't exercise this authority. I had some statistics or something. He was a bit upset about it, but not much. But he was... I want to be careful how I say this, but he was not a strong governor. You've got to read there's a piece today in the Free Press or the News by the fellow who was the former I can't think of his name for a moment, but he was the Chamber of Commerce, and he's largely responsible for the Republican apportioned legislature, in which he took issue with the ballot initiative that was promoted by the Republicans to adopt by initiative or by referendum limitation on the governor's authority in emergencies. And in it, he's very complimentary of Whitmer's role in the pandemic crisis as being a strong, forceful leader, et cetera, et cetera. And this is not something that could have been written by Jim Blanchard. He was too much of a politician, in my view. But that's the background of one of the letters I wrote to the News.
You mentioned that he was not a strong governor. I think he also felt that my perception was that he felt that his personal charm would win out over John Engler, because John Engler was not an attractive person. I happened to be dining at a restaurant the Sunday before voting day on that following Tuesday, and he was there with Bob Bowman, his treasurer, instead of campaigning. And it struck me as odd. And Engler beat him. He beat him by hard work. There was some kind of fire missing from him. From Blanchard. He didn't have the fire in his belly to beat Engler that time. He didn't work hard enough.
Well, you got to remember, he started out working for Frank Kelly. He was his driver. And he was always very political. When he ran for Congress, he was very political. And so when he became governor, his political proclivities outweighed his substantive decision-making.
Well, I think for him it was a good thing that the Chrysler crisis came along when it did, because it was his calling card. But I guess we'll turn away from Governor Blanchard and your relationship with him. And I'm going to throw you a little curveball, because we didn't talk about this, but I know about you something that has always struck me as remarkable. Your omnivorous intellect includes an enormous concern for history. And in fact, I ended up becoming a member of the Michigan Historical Society just by coming into contact with you when you came together with Robert Holmes Bell back in 1988, maybe it was. The two of you shared not many interests, I think, but one of them was in the history of the Michigan federal courts. And together, you worked with me on the Bar Journal to do a series of color maps prepared by a cartographer And I suspect that the money for this came from your pocket. I don't know. But if it didn't, I don't know where it came from, because we didn't have the budget at the Bar Journal for color then. We were a black and white book at that time, and it was tough. I had to get special appropriation approval to publish those color maps depicting the places of holding court for the federal courts in the state of Michigan since the time that it was part of the Northwest Territory. And that was you and Bob Bell. Can you talk a little bit about your interest in history? Because I find it, a man as busy as you were, a man with as many interests as you had, political and as a keen observer of the courts, and someone who read the advance sheets, and yet somehow you have this encyclopedic knowledge of history, and especially of Michigan history.
Well,
I want to open that can up a little bit and have you talk about it. How do you do it?
I can't explain it. All I know is I have a fascination with history, and I'm a quick study, quick learner, and a good memory. And I don't want to call it a hobby, but I like historical facts. I don't know how to explain that. I'm not an academic, but I have, I think, a bit of imagination, and I put it to use as collateral to my regular work. And you got to remember, as a federal judge, you have a lot of resources that you can call on. I have two sets of stationery. One that says United States District Judge, and the other just says my name and address. Depending on what I'm trying to accomplish is which form of stationery that I use. And if the letter's from a federal judge, you get a quicker answer. And I suppose I have a certain agility. I can't really tell you why, but I do. I am now the longest serving member of the Michigan Historical Society. I'm told.
One of its greater patrons, I think.
Well, I tried. Listen, I was wise in the choice of fathers.
Yes.
I can remember when I got my position as judge, my father couldn't figure out why. And someone said to my late wife, "How are you going to live on $58,000 a year?" That was the salary. She says, "I don't know. I'm going to do okay, but I'm not sure about Avern and the kids." But I've been fortunate through life. My father was a wise investor and always thought that his kids should get part of the largesse that was available to him. So I've had an independent source of income as a judge, and I've tried to use some of it as contributions in a wise way. That's all I can say.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you that every once in a while when I was working on something at the firm, I arrived there after your departure, so we didn't cross paths, but every once in a while I would find out I was working on something that involved the company you owned. You were fortunate, I think, to be able to be a judge who didn't need to be a judge. I think it gave you a remarkable perspective and a remarkable independence in your decision making. Truly beholden to no one but what you thought was correct. You did not serve a great deal on the Sixth Circuit, but I'd also like to ask you about the occasions when you did. Did you enjoy appellate judging?
Very much, very much. I like two parts of the job that are slightly different. First, serving on the Circuit Court of Appeals. After all, you're with two other judges, and the nature of the work, reviewing decisions, gives you an insight that's broader than you get as a district judge. And once or twice I've written opinions. I was a writer of opinions for the Sixth Circuit, the panel that had some impact. And I also remember building dissent. This week's New Yorker has a long article on rebels in Michigan, the Michigan militia phenomena, the gun-toting pickets and so forth. And this is centered around Grand Rapids. You know what I'm talking about, the area of Iraq. And we had a court case coming up from Grand Rapids where the federal attorney prosecuted half a dozen members of the Michigan militia for some crime. I'm not sure what it was. 5 or 6 of them, and 5 pled guilty and got 3 to 5 year sentences. The 6th did not plead guilty. He went to trial because his mother told him he should go to trial. So he went to trial and was convicted. And they get ready to score him under the guidelines. And the probation officer comes up with the guideline for terrorism. He wasn't a terrorist. He didn't fit the definition of a terrorist. But he got 40 years from Richard Enslin, who's now deceased, which was an outrageous sentence. And there was an appeal. And I was a dissenter. 2 of my colleagues voted to affirm a conviction and paid no attention to the penalty. And I wrote a very long dissent going into the history of terrorism. The word terrorism in a statute, what constitutes it, and how it fits. And I checked recently. He's still got about 30 years to go, which was outrageous. And so I had a chance to make my contribution to the jurisprudence, and indeed in a dissent, expressing disagreement with long criminal sentences. And the second aspect that I've enjoyed in this position is going to other districts and sitting as a district judge. So you walk into a strange city, you walk into a courtroom, you don't know anybody, nobody knows you, and you sit down and you preside over a case, either civil or criminal. The civil ones were usually jury trial. And so you develop a confidence in what you're doing because you're sort of like the traveling salesman who's successful in each city. And so those are 2 aspects of being a district judge that I always found a great deal of satisfaction. I have never said that I liked the job. I've eschewed that phrase because you sometimes have to do nasty things. There's things that are harsh. And to say that you like the job implies that you like to do the bad and the good. So you sentence a man for 20 years, and his mother's walking out of the courtroom, and she hears the judge say, "Boy, do I like this job. I never wanted that." I've always said I like the satisfaction of the job. And the longer I had it, I was a judge, the more, I think, a bit more gentle I became. For criminal convictions that I dealt with my first 10 years, I should imagine if you compared the sentences, they were a third to a half harsher than the sentences I imposed in the last 10 years.
That's very, very interesting.
The most important characteristic of a judge, quality, is compassion. A person who lacks compassion shouldn't be a judge.
Volcker had a formula for it. He said there's a combination of heart and head. Those with no heart, those with no head are to be avoided. Those who combine heart and head are the best judges.
Okay. Anyhow, you got more questions?
Only one other that I also wondered about. I asked Justice Kavanaugh when I interviewed him.
Pardon?
I asked Justice Kavanaugh when I interviewed him the question I'm going to ask you. Did you ever have a decision that was reversed on appeal but upheld, where the Supreme Court said what you had done was correct?
Yeah, well,
Any of you? And did you take satisfaction in that if it happened?
well, if I understand your question correctly, I'm not sure I do, is I had a case involving a challenge to a pharmaceutical patent that I decided in favor of the challenger. And the owner of the patent lawyer said, "You can't do that." I mean, my reasoning. And I said, I just did. Took it to the Federal Circuit, Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, and I was reversed 2-1. Upholding decision upheld the rights of the patent owner. And so the loser took it to the Supreme Court. And on a petition for writ of certiorari, the Solicitor General filed an amicus brief urging the court to take the appeal. And my decision was affirmed 9-0. A highly technical point of patent law and length of patent and so forth. I always got great satisfaction out of that.
The owner of the patent.
As anyone would, especially because you had no special expertise in patent law,
No.
except what you acquired on the bench.
Yeah, but I acquired a lot.
Yes.
I don't think I'd ever read a patent before I became a judge.
Yeah.
So my early years on the bench, I had several patent cases that presented a real challenge. And I had a friend who was a lawyer in a patent law firm. And I would only call him late at night for advice on how to handle some point. And I think over the years I developed a certain skill in patent law cases. More than once a colleague called me and asked me if I'd take over a case. And I take a case. Yes, you got to remember, one of the most notorious patent suits in the 1980s was the intermittent windshield wiper.
Yes, I remember.
And that case got a lot of publicity.
Was that yours?
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I had them for 5 years. I had every automobile manufacturer.
That was a wow. That's the subject of a whole separate interview.
Well, yeah.
We've just about exhausted the time budgeted, but I do want to ask you just an open-ended question. If there's any comment you'd like to make in closing about your relationship with Michigan justices and your impact on Michigan jurisprudence, and what your, if I may ask it this way, what was your greatest source of satisfaction in all of those interactions?
Brandeis was supposed to have said, or it was said of Brandeis, that he had concern for the other fella. And the greatest satisfaction I've gotten in this job is to ameliorate situations where you could ameliorate the harshness of the law. Apropos, well, no, that's the greatest satisfaction. That on the criminal side, a goodly number of the people here in front of you, offenders are poor, come from broken homes, get caught up in doing bad things, and they have to be punished. To be sure that the punishment does not outstrip the crime. And to the extent that I was able to do, I've been able to do that. Some of my toughest situations is where somebody's arrested, they're in custody, they come to the court to be released, and the U.S. attorney wants them locked up, pending trial. And you can stick your finger in the eye of the U.S. attorney and release them on bond. That gives you real satisfaction. They may ultimately be punished and be incarcerated, but you have shown not softness, but an understanding. And those are the most knockdown and drag-out situations I faced. It is to resist the power of government. Can't say resist the power of government, but government personified by people. And, we're seeing that right now in this presidential campaign. We're seeing a president who latest Twitter is boycott Goodyear because they did something that offended him.
And his most recent iteration of that is he's going to find out if the tires in the Secret Service vehicles he rides in are made by Goodyear, and if so, have them changed.
Judge, we're fortunate in Michigan to have had not a small man, but a large man occupy the seat you occupied for 40 years. I want to thank you because I know you could have chosen anyone to interview you. I hope you've had a chance to say things that you wanted to say. And let me tell you that for myself, it's been a privilege and an honor to be part of the process. I wish you my very best in what is a well-deserved retirement, and I hope it's a long one.
Thank you, and I appreciate this interview. I'm flattered by it, and I'm flattered that the Historical Society thinks that whatever I did in life was important enough, significant enough to be memorialized in digital format. Thanks.
Thank you.